Now available in paperback and Kindle Unlimited, John Haynes, A Conversation with Death. The man who rules the world and the angel of darkness take on a horde of demons in this inaugural John Haynes series adventure. Get John Haynes, A Conversation with Death for 99 cents on Kindle or in paperback today. Recently, Buffy the Vampire Slayer creator Joss Whedon announced that he is planning to reboot his classic 1990s series Buffy the Vampire Slayer with a black female lead. And the internet went into an uproar over this announcement. And when they went into an uproar over this announcement, it showed how hypocritical many of these feminists and SJWs are. Now, many feminists consider Buffy Summers from Buffy the Vampire Slayer to be a feminist icon because she's a strong heroine who led a television series for 7 years. And many SJWs like Buffy the Vampire Slayer as a television series because in the 1990s they grew up with this series and this series was a part of their childhood. And what makes these people hypocrites is the fact that they are outraged over this decision to make Buffy Summers a black woman because many of these same people went out of their way to bully and shame many white comic fans, many black comic fans, many comic fans of color who were male because they were upset regarding the failed diversity campaign at Marvel Comics called SJW Marvel. Now, during the time of this SJW Marvel campaign, as it started, many white and black and Hispanic and Asian male comic fans were upset over the decision to change the ethnicities of many of Marvel's most popular characters, like the female Thor, where they changed the gender of Thor to a woman, and then they gave us this black female Iron Man, Riri Williams. And then they gave us a black Captain America, Sam Wilson. And then they gave us a black Hispanic Spider-Man, Miles Morales, and an Asian Hulk. And as Marvel launched this campaign where they forced diversity onto many of their main characters who were primarily white males, many comic fans said that this was wrong because by changing the ethnicity of the character, they were changing the story. But once Joss Whedon decided to change the ethnicity of Buffy Summers, that's where we saw the anger coming from many of these feminists and SJWs. And what makes them hypocrites is that they now are saying what many of the white male comic fans said regarding the changing of the ethnicity of a character. They're saying that this is wrong, and they're saying that it's wrong because it's changing the ethnicity of a character they grew up liking. And that's what really shows what hypocrites they are, because these same people went out of their way to call many of the white male comic fans, the black male comic fans, the Hispanic male comic fans, and male comic fans of color racist, sexist, and bigots because they refused to support these ethnicity heroes who had forced diversity on people. And the reason why they were making these shaming language is because these SJWs thought that they weren't racist. However, with the announcement, of the black Buffy Summers, they show how racist they truly are. Now, I've said in numerous videos that when it comes down to your white feminist, she is one of the biggest racists in the room. And the announcement that we're going to get a black Buffy the Vampire Slayer shows how racist many of these feminists and SJWs are. Because when it comes down to Buffy the Vampire Slayer, one of their feminist icons, they want to make her white because she represents an ideal of beauty, and she represents an ideal of a strong woman. And they don't want the black woman to be this ideal of beauty, and they don't want her to be represented as an ideal of what it means to be a woman. And that's why many of these feminists and SJWs are out here angry, because they don't want a black woman to be on the same level as a white woman. And they don't want a black woman to be seen as beautiful as a white woman. They don't want her to be seen as attractive as a white woman. And they don't want her playing a character that is an icon just like a white woman. And Buffy Summers is an icon to many of these feminists and SJWs, and they want their icons to remain white just like they are and elevate their image. And again, they make a fair point that it does change the character, because once you make a character a different ethnicity, you're going to have to deal with a different culture and a different lifestyle, and that's going to change the story of Buffy the Vampire Slayer. And as a guy who writes science fiction and fantasy featuring things like vampires, like I did in my recent ISIS series books, ISIS Night of the Vampires, ISIS Bride of Dracula, and ISIS Escape from Transylvania, I showed that there's a difference between the way black people view the world and white people view the world. And as I see it, Buffy the Vampire Slayer story is that of a white female. So they can have their Buffy the Vampire Slayer because that's a white person's story. And I wouldn't want to have a black character, a black person playing a white female character, because again, the culture and experiences are completely different than that of a black woman. So that's why I wouldn't want to see a black Buffy, because there aren't that many black girls named Buffy in the black community. That's not our thing. And our culture is completely different. That's why I wouldn't want to see a black Buffy the Vampire Slayer, because our culture and our history would not be fairly represented on this show. Because this show, as Joss Whedon and this black female showrunner are going to put together, it's going to be a show that is going to be very similar to Black Lightning, a show filled with identity politics, a show filled with a lot of forced diversity, and I doubt we're going to see a black Angel or a black Giles on this black Buffy the Vampire Slayer show. It'll just be a show where we have a black Buffy, and she'll be deifying and worshiping white men, and that's not something I would want to see in a black show featuring vampires. No, when it comes down to vampires, vampire culture, and vampire lore, I would like to see, if you're going to do something that features an African American dealing with this culture, I want to see something that gives us a story about vampires from an original perspective, something that gives us a story that incorporates parts of African American culture and African American history, and something that explores the black experience, not some whitewashed show featuring forced diversity where you have this black girl as the Slayer, and then you have her surrounded by a whole host of white guys and her being chased by some white dude. No, that's some black woman's sexual fetish and her sexual fantasy coming to life on screen, not a rich and in-depth story like I tried to present in stories like the ISIS series, where I did the Night of the Vampires, the Bride of Dracula, and Escape from Transylvania, where I gave you an in-depth perspective on how black people view vampires and vampire culture and vampire lore, and even talk about how it relates to things like the goth subculture. So I go in depth in when I wrote about vampires, and I want to go in depth even further in another story I'm planning called Eternal Night. So when I look at this black Buffy, I just see it as something that is something we don't need, because it's giving us a rehash of an already iconic show, and it's something that really tells a story but does not give us a fresh perspective on these characters. I don't want a black Buffy, but I don't want a black Buffy because, again, when you change the ethnicity of a character, you change the character, and you change their story. And when it comes down to the story of Buffy the Vampire Slayer, she's a valley girl from California. She's white, she's blonde, and she can stay white and blonde because I believe black people can do better than trying to be a chocolate colored white person. No, we can tell our own stories. We can tell better stories about vampires, and we can tell better stories about vampire lore. Because when I take a look at a movie like Blade, that was a story that told a story about vampires from a black perspective, and Wesley Snipes did an amazing job with it. And when I take a look at Vampire in Brooklyn, even though it had its technical issues, it did do a great job of exploring vampires, vampire culture, and vampire lore. And I believe that African Americans can do better than having to deal with a chocolate colored vampire slayer, because that's a retread of a retread of a retread. Now, Buffy the Vampire Slayer, the TV show, was a reboot of a movie, and in Buffy the Vampire Slayer, for a brief moment, Buffy the Vampire Slayer died, and we did get a Black Slayer. That Black Slayer's name was Kendra the Vampire Slayer, and I believe she was a part of Buffy Season 2, because it's been a long time since I've watched this series, because I watched almost every episode except for that dreadful Season 4 with the cyborgs, and Kendra was a big prominent player in Buffy. But they killed off Kendra again because when it comes down to these white supremacists in Hollywood, they don't like the idea of a black female being the equal of a white female, and Kendra having the same power as Buffy was something that Joss Whedon didn't like back then. And that shows his hypocrisy overall, because with his creativity, he could have easily brought back Kendra for a spin-off series, and he could have done a Kendra the Vampire Slayer series and told the story about a black vampire slayer from Kendra's perspective, because this same guy, again, killed off Faith, who was a slayer, and then brought Faith back, but he can't bring back Kendra. And that shows how racist your Joss Whedon was back then, and it shows how racist he is right now. And again, this is the core reason why I believe we need to create our own African American fantasy stories, our own African American science fiction stories, and if we want to create our own vampire stories, then we need to tell them from our perspective, from our experience, and we don't need a black Buffy. No, we need to create our own characters, like I'm trying to do with the Lilith Graves character that I started out in Isis Night of the Vampires. You want to create your own characters so that people will follow that character, and that character will tell our story from our experience. If you'd like to read my vampire stories like Isis Night of the Vampires, Isis Bride of Dracula, and Isis Escape from Transylvania, you may do so by picking up the Vampire Arc on Amazon.com in paperback and e-reader formats. And if you want to try some of my other SJS Direct publications, like the Isis series, the E-Steam series, The Temptation of John Haynes, and the Smithsterella trilogy, you may do so by clicking the link to Amazon.com in the description box. That's all I have to say for this video. You can comment, rate, and subscribe.